I'm standing in the Carter Estate's library, surrounded by my family, with sunlight glinting off polished wood and the soft murmur of voices fading into a tense hush. All eyes are on me. My Uncle Charles lowers his glass, a look of wary confusion crossing his face. My cousin Brandon stops tapping away on his phone. Even Lauren, always poised, leans forward slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. No one knows yet why I'm holding a thick folder of legal documents in my hands. No one suspects the story I'm about to tell. I take a slow breath, steadying my voice. Before we talk about selling the estate, there's something I need to share. Charles raises an eyebrow, polite but dismissive. Sam, can this wait? We're on a schedule. I shake my head. It can't wait, because some of you live in a building you don't actually own. And the person who does is me. A ripple of silence rolls through the room. Brandon frowns, half laughing. What are you talking about? I set the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal deeds and corporate records stamped and notarized. You've all spent years assuming I was struggling, that I was the quiet one who never quite fit in. You measured my worth by the car I drive, or the parties I skip. You assumed I stayed small because I couldn't manage anything bigger. I glance at each of them in turn. But while you were busy chasing attention, I was buying assets you never thought to look for. Lauren speaks up, her voice more puzzled than cruel. Sam, what is this about? I nod toward the papers. It's about the fact that I'm not just your cousin. I'm your landlord. And as of this morning, I own 37% of Carter Realty. Charles stares at me, mouth slightly open. The room seems to tilt as if the very walls are trying to absorb what I've just said. Because for the first time in years, I'm not the invisible girl in the back of the room. I'm the one holding the cards, and this is just the beginning. My name is Samantha Carter. Everyone calls me Sam. I'm 33, and for most of my life I've been the person in my family who blends into the background. I'm not flashy. I don't wear designer clothes or fly off to private islands just because it's Thursday. Instead, I've built a life that looks simple from the outside. A small apartment near Fairmount Park, a navy blue Chevy Malibu that's seen better days, weekends spent hiking or reading financial reports over coffee. People see that and assume I'm struggling, but that's because they never really looked deeper. My parents weren't wealthy. My dad was an architect who believed beautiful spaces should feel like home, not trophies. My mom taught kindergarten and used to save up for months just to take me to the Franklin Institute or the Art Museum. When I was 16, they died in a highway accident coming back from a short vacation. My world collapsed. That was when my grandmother, Margaret Carter, stepped in. She brought me to live here in the Carter Estate, a place so big it has rooms no one's used in decades, and where the echoes of conversations seem to linger in the hallways. Margaret wasn't just the matriarch of the family. She was the founder of Carter Realty, a real estate empire that started small and grew into a name whispered in boardrooms across Philadelphia. But unlike some in our family, Grandma Margaret believed wealth should be quiet. She taught me that power doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who says the least. And she made sure I knew how the business worked, from reading financial statements to spotting undervalued neighborhoods to protecting assets with smart legal structures. While my cousins were learning how to network over champagne, I was learning how to build something solid, away from the spotlight. I never planned to keep secrets from my family. But the longer I watched them measure each other's worth in cars, houses, and flashy donations, the more I realized they'd never understand the life I chose. And eventually, that distance turned into silence, until now. I still remember my first night at the Carter Estate. 16 years old, suitcase in hand, standing under the vaulted ceilings of the foyer, while the smell of polished wood and old roses wrapped around me. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the housekeeper who'd worked for the Carters since before I was born, was the first friendly face I saw. She hugged me gently, whispered that everything would somehow be all right, and ushered me upstairs to a bedroom bigger than my entire old apartment. But no amount of satin drapes or antique furniture could make me feel at home that night, because I knew this wasn't my world. I came from a family that clipped coupons, not trust funds, from parents who talked about saving, not leveraging assets. Downstairs, I could hear voices my family gathered for dinner. I stood at the top of the stairs, peeking through the railing, afraid to join them. Eventually, Grandma Margaret called for me. She was sitting at the head of the long mahogany dining table, wearing a simple dark suit, a pearl necklace shining against her throat. Her voice was calm. Sam, come sit. Your family. That means you belong here. So I did. But the conversation around that table felt like a foreign language. My cousins Brandon and Lauren were already slipping into the rhythms of the wealthy, talking about ski trips, new phones, summer internships at firms I'd only heard of on TV. Lauren was only 17, but already talking about building a personal brand. Brandon had just gotten his driver's license and a brand new car with a giant red bow in the driveway. I still had my dad's old car keys in my pocket. At first, they weren't cruel. Not exactly. Brandon would ask questions that sounded harmless, but carried a sharp edge. So, Sam, you ever flown first class? Lauren would tilt her head and say things like, "That sweater is cute. Vintage, right?" And even though her tone was sweet, I knew she meant it looked cheap. I tried to brush it off, but little moments kept piling up. Like the time Grandma Margaret invited me to help her review property portfolios in her study. I sat beside her listening to her talk about cap rates and cash flows, neighborhoods on the cusp of revitalization. It felt like a secret world opening up. Meanwhile, outside her study doors, my cousins rolled their eyes. Brandon muttered to Lauren, "Guess Sam's gonna be the family's accountant." Lauren snickered, "Or the librarian." It stung, more than I wanted to admit, but Margaret kept me close. She'd take me into the city on weekends, showing me buildings Carter Realty had bought long ago. She'd point out the subtle signs of change, new businesses opening streets, getting repaved. She'd whisper, "Value doesn't always wear a sign. You have to train your eyes to see it." By the time I was 19, I knew how to read a zoning map better than most real estate agents. Still, that didn't make family gatherings easier. At Christmas, there were parties with chefs brought in from New York orchestras playing by the grand staircase. And every year someone would ask me if I'd found a nice boy to help me afford a better lifestyle. By my early 20s, the gap between me and my cousins had become a canyon. Brandon was working at Carter Realty wearing expensive suits and tossing out buzzwords like synergy. Lauren had launched a lifestyle blog full of glossy photos and luxury brand sponsorships. I was living in a studio apartment working entry-level jobs while saving every cent I could manage. But what my family didn't know was that behind those late nights in second-hand clothes, I was studying, running numbers on neighborhoods no one cared about yet, buying small properties under LLCs with names no one would connect to me, because Grandma Margaret had taught me the game. And while my cousins kept score with cars and handbags, I started keeping score with deeds and equity stakes. It was lonely. Sometimes unbearably so, but Margaret's voice always echoed in my mind. "One day, Sam, people will finally see you for who you are, but until then, let them underestimate you. It's the best advantage you'll ever have." And slowly, in the shadows, I was building something no one in that dining room would ever expect. By the time the annual Carter Family Conference rolled around again, the leaves in Philadelphia had already started turning red and gold. Walking up the stone steps of the Carter estate, I felt the weight of old memories pressing on my shoulders. Inside the grand foyer was buzzing with conversation. Caterers glided past carrying silver trays piled high with hors d'oeuvres. A soft piano played in the distance. But beneath the polite laughter, the air carried a sharp undercurrent, the same tension that had been growing for years. Charles stood near the fireplace, shaking hands, laughing a little too loudly. His graying hair was slicked back, his custom suit immaculate, but a faint crease between his brows betrayed stress he tried to hide. As soon as he saw me, he gave a quick smile. "Samantha, good to see you," he said. "Settled into your cozy place in Fairmount Park." The words were polite, but the edge was unmistakable. I nodded. It's home. Brandon drifted over a glass of whiskey in his hand, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my car. "Sam, you should come see my new apartment," he said, grinning. "The concierge knows me by name now. You'd love it. Windows all the way around, city views, not a single creaky floorboard." Lauren joined us, her silk blouse the color of champagne hair twisted up in an elegant knot. She studied my simple navy dress, then smiled, not unkindly but carefully distant. "I'm sure your place has charm," she said. I ignored the sting in my chest. Inside, the library chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a screen. Charles called the room to order. He cleared his throat. "Family, thank you all for being here. As you know, the real estate market has been shifting fast. We've built Carter Realty into one of Philadelphia's premier firms, but we can't stand still." He clicked the remote, and the screen behind him glowed to life, showing an aerial shot of the Carter estate, surrounded by the blaze of autumn trees. A hush fell over the room. Charles gestured toward the image. "This property sits on 5 acres of some of the city's most desirable land. Developers have been contacting me for months. They're offering figures that, frankly, I never thought we'd see." Murmurs rippled through the room. Lauren leaned forward, eyes shining. How much are we talking? Charles smiled. We've received serious interest at around $55 million. Brandon let out a low whistle. That's insane. You know what we could do with that kind of capital. Charles nodded. Exactly. We could modernize our entire portfolio, fund new commercial projects, expand our brand presence from DC to Boston. He paused, letting the anticipation build. But to make this happen, we'd have to sell the estate, tear it down, build high-end condos in its place. Silence settled like a weight. Lauren folded her arms. We'd be fools not to take it. The mansion's beautiful, but it's just old. Brandon chimed in. We could each take a cut, diversify. I've got contacts looking for fresh investments. This could set us all up. Charles raised a cautioning hand. Of course we'd vote on it. Family decisions require consensus. But as you all know, voting rights are proportional to declared assets. I felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. Charles held nearly 40% of the votes. Brandon and Lauren together had another 30%. My tiny declared stake amounted to barely 2%. Charles turned his gaze to me, almost gentle. Samantha, I know this place has sentimental value for you, but think about what your parents would have wanted. Security, opportunity. Isn't that what Margaret always taught us? I clenched my jaw. Grandma Margaret also believed that some things are worth preserving, that this house is part of who we are. Charles nodded as if considering it, but his eyes were distant. Lauren leaned closer. Sam, we love this place too, but nostalgia doesn't pay property taxes. And besides, don't you ever want more than this? She gestured vaguely at my outfit, my life. Brandon added, you could finally upgrade that car of yours. Laughter trickled through the room, polite but stinging. Charles pressed on. Look, we'll let the numbers speak. After lunch, we'll do a preliminary vote, and of course, any final deal would require signatures. He paused, then said quietly, Samantha, I'd really hate to see you left behind. The words weren't loud, but they hit me harder than any shout. Because that was the story they'd always believed about me, the girl who was destined to be left behind. As everyone rose to break for lunch, Brandon clapped me lightly on the shoulder. Hey, don't stress Sam. You've still got that charming little apartment right, and plenty of time to find a husband who can help out. I forced a tight smile, my chest tight, because what they didn't know was that I wasn't the one who was about to be left behind. And the next time we gathered in this room, I planned to prove it. Lunch at the Carter estate was served in the formal dining room beneath a chandelier glittering like a cascade of ice. Plates arrived in perfect silence. Filet mignon, haricots verts, tiny roasted potatoes arranged like art. But I barely tasted a bite, because I knew what was waiting after dessert. And sure enough, once coffee was poured, Charles tapped his knife against his glass. Family, he said, his voice smooth as the silk tie knotted at his throat. It's time we talk numbers. We all filed back into the library. A quiet hush fell over the room as Charles took his place at the front again. He gestured for the lights to dim, then clicked a slide onto the screen behind him, a chart showing the family's assets, individual holdings, and voting shares. Samantha, he said, glancing in my direction with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, would you like to start? My throat felt dry. I stood slowly. I've continued my consulting work this year, I said, and maintained steady growth in my investments. Brandon gave a little huff of laughter. Investments. Sam, come on. Are we talking real investments, or are we talking a Roth IRA and a couple of municipal bonds? A ripple of low laughter moved around the room. Lauren, leaning forward in her chair, rested her chin on her hand. Sam, no offense, but this is serious business. People here have tens of millions in play. We can't run the family like a charity. I felt my pulse pounding. I'm not asking for charity, I said, voice tightening. I'm saying there's more to value than just balance sheets. Charles cleared his throat. That's admirable, Sam. But your stake is, well, very modest. And we can't let nostalgia hold us back from an offer like this. Brandon grinned, his voice dripping with playful cruelty. Exactly. We're talking about real money, not whatever pocket change Sam's got tucked under her mattress. Lauren interjected, trying to soften the blow, but only making it worse. It's not that we don't appreciate how frugal you are, Sam, but this is about the future of the Carter name. I swallowed hard. And what does the Carter name stand for exactly? I shot back. Ripping out the heart of our family history to build condos for people who won't even care who lived here. Brandon rolled his eyes. History doesn't pay property taxes. You should know that better than anyone. I mean, you've been on a budget your whole life. Lauren gave me a sympathetic look. Sam, it's not personal, but this place is falling apart. We could replace it with something that represents who we are now. I glanced around the room, seeing nods. Aunt Valerie chimed in, voice sweet as syrup. And dear, there's no shame in knowing your limitations. We can't all be visionaries. A sharp, quiet pain went through my chest. All those years, they'd watched me as the quiet one, the polite one, the girl who didn't belong. Charles held up a hand. Let's not belabor the point. I'm calling a preliminary vote. Who's in favor of pursuing the development offer? Hands rose immediately. Brandon's, Lauren's, Aunt Valerie's, Uncle Richard's. One by one, almost the entire room signaled their support. Charles lowered his hand. Looks like we have a consensus. Samantha, I hope you'll come around. I tried to speak, but Brandon cut me off. Sam, you're living in a rental. You drive a car older than half the people in this room. How are you going to weigh in on a $55 million deal? A flicker of something crossed Charles's face, regret maybe, or perhaps calculation. Samantha, he said quietly, I know this place means a lot to you, but business is business. We can't afford sentimentality, especially from someone who hasn't contributed at the same level as the rest of us. I clenched my hands so tightly my nails bit into my palms. I have contributed. Just because I haven't been loud about it doesn't mean I haven't been working. Brandon let out a bark of laughter. Working on what, your hobby consulting gigs or that retirement plan for your imaginary millions? A flush rose on my cheeks. I've been building something real, I said, voice trembling but growing stronger. Quietly, carefully. Just like Grandma taught me. Lauren's smile slipped. Sam, even Grandma would have understood a business opportunity like this. The world has changed. Charles gave me a patient look. You're not wrong to love this place, but the numbers don't lie. And right now, the numbers say sell. My chest tightened. I looked at each face in the room. The same faces that had watched me grow up patted me on the head, called me sweet and quiet and sensible, and never once thought to ask what I'd been doing with my life. Charles spread his hands. Sam, if you have a counterproposal, now's the time. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the papers I'd been carrying for years onto the table and watch the shock ripple through them like a tidal wave. But I caught myself. Not yet. Instead, I took a deep breath, swallowing the rage, and said calmly, maybe I do have a proposal, but I'll share it tomorrow. Brandon chuckled. Sure, Sam. Can't wait to hear what thrift store plan you've cooked up. As the meeting broke up, I slipped from the room, my mind racing. Because what they'd never understood was that quiet didn't mean powerless, and tomorrow, they'd finally learn who they'd been dismissing all these years. Late that night, the Carter estate was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway outside my room. I sat at the antique desk near the window, my laptop open, the glow of the screen painting my face in cool blue light. Lines of spreadsheets stared back at me, numbers precise and orderly, a quiet empire hidden in plain sight. This was the truth I'd kept from my family for over a decade. It started the year Grandma Margaret passed away. I inherited a modest sum compared to my cousins. They spent theirs on condos and cars. I didn't. Instead, I used it as seed money. I began small, buying a duplex in an overlooked neighborhood on the edge of Fishtown. While Brandon and Lauren were popping champagne at rooftop bars, I was repainting stairwells and learning how to negotiate with contractors. 2 years later, I sold that duplex for nearly double what I'd paid. I rolled those profits into 2 more properties, each one bought through an LLC that kept my name off public records. Over the next 10 years, I expanded methodically. Small apartment buildings, commercial storefronts in neighborhoods nobody else was paying attention to, at least not yet. I kept my investments diversified, careful sometimes, partnering silently with local developers who were happy to let an anonymous investor help finance renovations in exchange for a share of future profits. No flashy headlines, no family signatures, and certainly no reason for the Carters to suspect a thing. By the time I turned 33, I owned 14 residential buildings and 4 commercial properties scattered across Philadelphia. But my most significant move came 2 years ago. I'd learned that a controlling interest 30% in Carter Realty had quietly become available. Not publicly, not on the stock market. Through a private equity firm divesting its stake. Charles had been so busy chasing high-profile development deals that he'd missed the signs. But I hadn't. I used a trust, Margaret's Legacy Trust, to acquire the shares in small discrete purchases over 18 months. Each transaction small enough not to trigger alarms. Each one shielded through multiple legal layers. Jacob Ellis, my attorney, orchestrated every step, ensuring no link led directly back to me. It wasn't impossible to hide a fortune even in this digital age. Not if you knew how to build walls of paper strong enough to keep curious eyes out. And while my name remained absent from headlines and asset lists, my influence grew, quietly, patiently, just as Grandma Margaret had taught me. And the irony, Brandon and Lauren both rented apartments in a luxury building called Independence Tower. A building that, as of last year, I fully owned. Every month, a portion of their rent flowed directly into one of my LLCs. Not out of spite, but because it was simply good business. I stared at the rows of numbers on my screen, feeling both calm and nervous. Because tomorrow, hiding wouldn't be enough. Tomorrow, it was time to speak. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Carter Estate Library as we gathered for the final session of the conference. The room felt tense, like the moment before a storm breaks. Brandon scrolled absently through his phone, while Lauren sat upright, a folder of notes clasped tightly in her manicured hands. Charles stood at the front, clearing his throat. Before we wrap up, I'd like to finalize the vote on the mansion sale and begin preparing documents for Westbrook Developments. He gestured to the assistants in the back, who began distributing thick folders. That's a $55 million deal on the table, Charles said. It's the future of this family's assets. Brandon leaned forward. I'm ready to sign. I already have a lead on a beachfront investment. Lauren gave a small nod. Same here. This place is beautiful, but we can build something even more iconic. Charles smiled thinly. Excellent. Then, unless there are objections? I stood. A hush fell over the room. Charles blinked at me. Samantha, is there something you'd like to say? Yes, I replied, voice steady. I'd like to show you all exactly who I am. Brandon gave a soft laugh. Sam, this really isn't the time. It's the perfect time. I set a sleek leather folder onto the table. Because for years you've all assumed my quiet meant I had nothing worth saying. Lauren tilted her head, a wary look in her eyes. Sam, what is this about? I opened the folder and pulled out a slim stack of papers, each stamped and notarized. This is the ownership trail of Margaret's Legacy Trust, and a record of recent transactions. Charles stiffened. What transactions? I glanced at each face around the table. Over the past 18 months, I used the trust to acquire a 30% stake in Carter Realty. Brandon made a noise somewhere between a scoff and a cough. That's impossible. It's not, I said. The shares were held by a private equity firm. They wanted out, I wanted in. Each purchase was small enough not to appear on any single report, until they added up. Lauren whispered almost to herself. But why would you do that in secret? Because I knew if Charles knew someone was quietly buying influence, he'd try to block it. I paused, letting my words sink in. And because sometimes, silence is power. Charles stared at me, jaw clenched. Even if this is true, you'd still need more than 30% to stop this sale. I held up another document. Which is why, as of 9 o'clock this morning, Margaret's Legacy Trust acquired Jacob Ellis Development, a company that owns 7% of Carter Realty. Together, that's 37%, enough to block any decision. Brandon let out a nervous laugh. Wait, so you're saying you've been running around buying pieces of the family business? Yes, I said calmly, and I've also been investing quietly in real estate all across Philadelphia. I flipped to another page. For example, Independence Tower, the luxury apartment complex downtown, I own it outright. Lauren stared at me, color draining from her face. I live there. I know, I replied. Your rent checks go to one of my LLCs. Brandon gaped. So you're... what? Our landlord? Yes, and your excellent tenants. Around the room, people shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between me and the documents. Charles tried to rally. Even so, we're talking about the Carter estate. It's emotional for you, I understand. But you can't derail a $55 million deal based on nostalgia. I met his gaze evenly. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about legacy. Grandma Margaret built this family's wealth not just on profits, but on purpose. Selling this house for condos isn't purpose. It's erasing who we are. Brandon crossed his arms. And what? You're going to single-handedly decide that for all of us. "No," I said softly. "I'm not deciding alone. I'm simply refusing to let you decide alone either." Charles looked at me quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "So, what do you propose, Samantha?" I drew in a breath. "That the mansion stays. That it becomes the headquarters for the Margaret Carter Foundation, a place dedicated to financial education and community support. A place that honors what Grandma stood for." Silence filled the room. And for the first time all weekend, no one interrupted me. The silence after my proposal stretched long enough to hear the distant ticking of the old clock in the corner. Charles let out a slow exhale, folding his arms across his chest. "So, all this time you've been maneuvering behind the scenes, buying up shares, playing the market." I met his eyes without flinching. "I've been investing in the future of this family, even if you didn't see it." Brandon shifted in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Sam, this is insane. You're telling me you've been my landlord for 2 years, and you never said a word." I shrugged gently. "It was business. You were good tenants. I didn't see the point in making it personal." Lauren leaned forward, her expression caught somewhere between awe and embarrassment. "Sam, why didn't you tell us we've been treating you like some struggling cousin?" "Because you never asked," I said softly, "and because I needed the freedom to build without interference." Aunt Valerie cleared her throat, her voice tentative. "Well, this certainly explains why you always seemed so calm. All these years, we thought you were just modest." Charles rubbed his temples as if fighting a headache. "And now you're blocking the mansion sale." "I'm preserving it," I corrected, "for something bigger than another condo project." Brandon let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Man, I honestly don't know whether to be mad or impressed." Lauren offered me a hesitant smile. "I guess it's kind of incredible. You really pulled this off." I looked around the room. I never wanted to embarrass anyone. I just wanted Grandma's legacy to mean something real, and to prove that success doesn't have to scream to be powerful. Charles's gaze met mine, the edges of his sternness softening just a fraction. "Perhaps we underestimated you, Samantha." I nodded. "That's all right. Underestimation has its uses." And for the first time in years, I felt like I finally belonged in that room. On my own terms. That night, the conference officially ended, but Charles lingered in the library long after the others had left. He stared at the empty chairs, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the table. Then he picked up his phone and made a quiet call. "Mark, it's Charles Carter. I want a deep dive on Margaret's Legacy Trust, and on any entities connected to Samantha Carter. I don't care how many layers of paperwork there are. Find me leverage." On the other end, the voice was cautious. "That could be sensitive, sir." Charles's voice grew cold. "I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm asking you to find me information. The kind that makes people cooperative." Meanwhile, upstairs in my room, my phone buzzed with a message from Jacob Ellis. "They're digging. Be ready." I stared at the screen, my jaw tight. If Charles thought he could pressure me into selling my stake, he was about to learn that my legal structures were built for storms exactly like this one. And if he tried to force my hand publicly, I'd be ready to tell the entire city exactly how the Carter family really did business. A week later, the Carter estate buzzed with reporters and camera crews gathered beneath the crisp autumn sky. I stepped up to the podium, a gentle breeze stirring the papers in my hand. Today I began voice clear. I'm announcing the creation of the Margaret Carter Foundation. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. This foundation will be dedicated to financial education and supporting local entrepreneurs, especially in communities that have been overlooked for too long. I paused, letting the words sink in. This house, the Carter estate, will become its headquarters. Not condos, not private clubs, but a place where knowledge and opportunity can grow. After the press conference, Charles approached me cautiously. "Samantha, perhaps the family could participate in some way." I gave him a small, polite smile. "You're welcome to volunteer. No board seats, no special privileges, just honest work." Brandon blinked at me, incredulous. "Volunteer like handing out flyers?" I nodded, or teaching classes about budgeting, or helping small businesses with planning. Lauren let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Well, I guess there's a first time for everything." And as I looked out over the estate grounds, I felt a quiet certainty. Because for the first time, this place and our family's wealth would stand for something bigger than ourselves. That evening, I stood alone in the rose garden, the crisp scent of autumn leaves mixing with the faint perfume of the last blooms. I looked up at the house glowing softly under the lights, and I thought of Grandma Margaret. All those quiet lessons, all those nights she whispered that true power didn't need applause. I'd always believed her. But for years, part of me wondered if she was wrong. If maybe the world only listened to the loudest voice in the room. Now I know better. Wealth isn't just dollars on a page. It's freedom. It's the ability to choose your own story and help others write theirs. And respect, the kind that matters, can't be bought with cars or condos. It's earned by standing for something real. So if you're listening, and you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you're too small to matter, remember this. Quiet doesn't mean invisible. Patience doesn't mean weakness. And the person everyone doubts might just be the one holding the future in their hands. I smiled, feeling the cool breeze ripple through the roses, because I wasn't hiding anymore. And for the first time, I felt completely free. Tell me, have you ever surprised people who thought they already knew your story? I'd love to hear yours.